when, some in this region may remember, it was not so long ago when the United States was lecturing people on how to manage their fiscal balances. So that confidence factor is a very important. I think, I don't know if it's structural, but certainly the U.S. is going to need to deal with its deficits. That's one thing. The other thing is that as long as we have, interest rates where they are, the dollar's going to be weak. And it looks like the policy of the fiscal authorities is not to do anything until next year to be sure that this recovery is solid. I think one other change in the world economy or question mark is the U.S. consumer. Traditionally you look to the U.S. consumer as the sort of driver of the world economy. Now, at least in this first phase of the recovery, we can see it's domestic demand and government stimulus in China that seems to be the number one driver. And I think, and we'll see in time, this downturn is not the Great Depression. A year ago, people were pulling out all their textbooks and reading about the Great Depression as though it had happened 2 years ago, looking for all the lessons about it. Now, again, it's faded back into history. But it did have a very long impact on people. I think for 3 or 4 or 5 years, this crisis will have an impact on consumers in particularly the United States, who have been such an engine of the world economy, because their retirements are so explicitly embodied in the financial markets. And to have seen, the joke is many of us in America have our retirement funds are called 401ks. And as the stock market collapsed, people started to say, well, now my 401k is a 201k. It had been cut in half. And I think that trauma tells people that Wall Street is not a one-way street. Markets go down rather as well as up. And so some of the prudency that Asia is known for in terms of saving, I think some of that is now into the psychology of Americans, and they're not going to quite have the kind of debt binge that we had that led us, was one of the factors that led us into this downturn.
That goes to the heart of the whole global imbalances debate that we're seeing unfolding now, post-crisis.
Yeah. I mean, it was, is interesting. I don't know how much it got noticed here, but a few months ago, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Mr. Bernanke, gave a speech, and his explanation of the economic downturn, why we've seen this recession, is that the United States had turned into a giant emerging market, and was living well beyond its means.
I've got to ask you, back to oil and the dollar, how long do you think it will be, Dan, before we see oil traded in currencies, in a basket of currencies perhaps, not the US dollar? Do you think we're decades away from that?
Well, that's always a question. If you go back to even to the 70s, whenever the dollar is weak, it's always talk about it's in other currencies, and then when the dollar strengthens, people forget that discussion and move on. It may be a failure of imagination on my part, but I think things will always basically, not always, but we'll go back into the dollar, whether, some may try and price it differently. If we had an extended, but part of the compensation for that then, and that also goes to higher oil prices, for the solution for exporting countries is higher prices if the dollar weakens because of purchasing power.
Who'd like to come in here? Yes, sir, gentleman in the second row.
Thank you. My name is Paulo Soares. I'm the ambassador of Brazil in Singapore. Mr. Daniel Yergin, you mentioned as the fourth change in the 21st century, technology, innovation. You mentioned solar, electrical, cars, batteries, wind, and natural gas. But you barely mentioned the other alternative, which is ethanol, biofuels. I'm sure you are aware that in Brazil, for that matter, and also in the United States, in Brazil at least, cars in Brazil, nowadays, the car production, 85% of our production is run by ethanol. My question is the following, and I would like to hear your perception. The estimation of the public and private sector in Brazil is that within 5 to 10 years, ethanol might as well become international marketplace commodity, competing with oil. So what is your perception? Do you believe that there is a place for ethanol becoming, in 5 or 10 years, international marketplace commodity? Thank you.
So that's a very interesting question, because last year we had this push towards ethanol and other food crops as a means to diversify away from fossil fuels, but that created food shortages in some country, and that was a concern in the broader.
Right. Well, you're certainly right. I went very quickly over biofuels. I just had that example of the U.S. that a quarter of the motor fuel is supposed to be biofuels. First, let me say, if we talk about changes in world energy, one of the changes is, of course, Brazil, which developed its biofuel industry because it thought it didn't have any oil. And as you know, Brazil is now well on its way to being an energy superpower. And I think the shipyards of Singapore are among those who are helping Brazil achieve its ambitions. And so from an oil point of view, and certainly Brazil is a leader of ethanol, I think Brazil has a particular advantage because it makes its ethanol from sugar, which is much more cost effective than doing it from corn, which is done in the United States. So in fact, Brazil is going to be an exporter. I guess currently, I think you're absorbing all of the ethanol in your domestic market, or most of it, but you will be a major exporter of ethanol, and there will be a major market for it, and it will be in North America, it will be in Europe. If we talk about innovation, I think the kind of path towards ethanol that the U.S. went down has proved to be volatile and difficult of making it out of corn. And so if we're putting our boxes, and I bet people here in Singapore are working on it because you're a research-oriented country, that obviously second and third generation biofuels, cellulosic is the term that's used, 5 years, 10 years from now will be significant. We know ExxonMobil has, with synthetic genomics, has made a $600 million commitment over 10 years to develop second generation from algae. Shell is doing it. BP is involved with the biofuels laboratory at Berkeley. So I think that 5-10 years from now, reasonable probability that we'll see, new forms of biofuel that won't impact food and be as controversial. And Brazil will be at the forefront. So.
Yes, there's a gentleman here in the second row who has a question.
Good morning. My name is Ong Keng Yong from the Institute of Policy Studies. Given the comment about the rapid advancement of technology, can you see nuclear power plant being next door to our homes and thereby becoming a rather good...
being where?
Nuclear power plants next door to our homes.
You mean little small ones?
Yeah, whatever, small one, big one, next door to where we live. Yeah, and thereby generating additional energy requirements for our needs. Because the concern has always been that nuclear plants have to be located quite far away from residential areas, not too close to big cities. But with the improvement in technology, can you see nuclear power becoming a much more acceptable source of energy, especially in the developing country? Yeah. You mentioned that 60% of the new nuclear power construction are in the developing emerging economies. So it seems like people are moving in that direction. And the related question is that, is nuclear power really carbon neutral as people make it out to be, or less carbon producing as the other fossil fuel? Right. Thank you.